Okay, cool. So we should be recording now, Kelly. Um, all right. Well, let's talk a little bit about the game plan here for today. Oops, you know what? My the Zoom link just took over our class. Let me go back here a few steps in my. There we go. All right, cool. So let's discuss the game plan for today. The first priority is for us to take a look at those final type specimen books. You know, at this point, we've looked at them and critiqued them a couple times now. So I wouldn't necessarily call what we're going to do today a critique so much as a presentation. But by all means, you know, if I do see anything that I would recommend that you tweak between now and portfolio, I'll certainly throw it out there for suggestions. But at this point, they are well refined and they were looking awesome last week. So I expect if anything at all, any critical feedback will be fairly minor. But otherwise, in terms of our content for the week, we're going to take a look at a new project today. It's a fairly fast one compared to the last one, and that it's about a week and a half turnaround time on it. And just sort of smaller in scope, which is good because that was a very large project you guys just worked on. In fact, I alluded to a project last week when you and I were on the call together that I was thinking about doing, and I'm still going to be doing it, that the LP record redesign. But after that last really large project, we're going to be doing a sort of a small one in between. So we'll talk about that. I've got a bunch of examples that I want to show you guys as well. There's a small exercise that we'll talk about also that is something that I'll give you a resource for. In fact, it's actually in the assignment sheet. There's a URL that you can use, and it's more or less as an exercise that kind of teaches you how to use a website that will identify fonts and typefaces. It's something that you guys should easily be able to finish fairly fast, you know, just during probably work time in class. There is the type analysis project worksheet here that we'll take a look at. And then there's two fairly long font guide lectures. I'm going to break these up across the, you know, today, Tuesday, as well as next class Thursday, because they're long. They're like 50 pages each. They're pretty beastly. And I think it will probably benefit you guys to have just a little bit of space in between, you know, the time it will take us to get through one and then the next one. So that's sort of the overview of the week. Why don't we begin by taking a look first and foremost at the type specimen submissions. So the last two classes that we've looked at these, I've kind of driven them because it's been more of a critique, but I'm going to pop these open here, and I would love if you could actually kind of talk me through what you've done here across this project, and we'll consider it a little bit more of a presentation than a critique.
Oh, okay. Like talk about like the bit of like design or thought process.
Yeah, absolutely, exactly. Like if you were
Okay.
presenting this to perhaps, you know, to me maybe for the first time, or even just presenting it maybe to, you know, a classroom of students. I know that it's just you and me here right now. Cam will obviously be able to take a look at the recording. But yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts. And it doesn't have to be terribly formal. This could be very much an informal kind of conversation. But you know, you've definitely heard my thoughts on this, but I'd love to hear like your thoughts on the cover, for example. Let's start with that and we'll work our way down.
Okay, yeah. So for the cover, um, what is it? Because I was definitely looking at the examples and like resources you gave us.
Mhm.
And the only thing I could like think about was, I don't know, I wanted the focus to be like the name of the font, but I thought it'd be cute to like to have the G be big, and then I don't know, I just like, and then play around with the different font types under
Cool.
Garamond
Yeah.
in the rest of the like name. And then but I decided to keep like the designer like the same and simple.
Sure. Which I think actually um, sets up a pretty strong typographical hierarchy there, you know, you know, we've talked many times this semester about hierarchy and how size and weight and all those things can be used to set up a strong hierarchy. But in this case, you're actually using all of those things in this title. And in general, this is what I love about this, Kelly. You're breaking the rules, but you're doing it in a really cool way. In general, I wouldn't recommend that we change more than like 3 visual clues to establish a hierarchy, because generally it becomes just kind of too much, you know? But
Mm,
in this case, because this is a type specimen book, you know, you made this decision to incorporate all of the different weights and letter, like, you know, the different variations, you know, right down to the italics as well. And it's appropriate because again, it's a type specimen book. So by doing that, you know, you're creating a large visual difference between the name Garamond and then Claude Garamond's name by just keeping that the way that you presented it. And I love the large G because it creates a really strong focal point. You know, there's, even though this, I would consider this a very simple, clean, professional design, there's a lot happening here, you know, typographically. And to combat that becoming the focal point, you started with this just enormous G. There's no doubt that this becomes the focal point. It's the largest, heaviest element on the page. And there's even a lot of contrast there, visual contrast between like the large area of white and like the dark blue. So there's a lot happening here to create a visual, like a really strong visual anchor. It just, you know, these two, you know, like the two stems essentially take us right to the rest of the word, and then just sort of naturally drops us off right at the name. And so there's a lot happening there, and I think there's a lot of good decisions that you made.
thank you. Yeah, and then I only stuck with white and blue. Like I played with the opacity of like the other elements, but I
Mhm.
wanted like to not be color crazy and
Yes,
like focus on the type or text itself.
yeah. I think that's a good decision as well. If you think about most of the specimens that we showed you, I mean, some of the ones that you saw that were digital in Behance got colorful, but most of them were not. And all of the, like the physical specimen books that I showed you guys were always like black, white, in a color. In fact, most of them were like black in a color and then just on newsprint. Because I do think that is a nice mechanism to use to kind of put the focus on the type. I mean, don't get me wrong, color can certainly be used to also enhance, like, and put focus on things. But if color is also something that is, I guess, just a complexity that we're adding to the project on top of, you know, some complex typographical arrangements, it's just a lot for our audience to kind of have to focus on. So you're just really, you're taking out one element of the equation and just allowing, you know, myself or anybody who's looking at this to really just focus on the type itself. So yeah, I think that was a good decision.
Yeah, and then I took your advice about changing the original shape elements I had to using like um letters from Garamond itself
Yeah,
as visual elements, and then I decided to take out that original like grid like lorem ipsum text I had
yeah, yeah,
and play around with put what I did for other pages like um faded out letters in the background as
yeah.
decoration.
Yeah, I think it makes a lot more sense, right? Because it's like kind of like what you're doing on the cover. You're introducing various letter forms to us, and you're letting the type itself kind of be the focal point. Even in this case, when you're using it in a very ambient way, that grid was just like so structured and so busy. I think it was really kind of competing with stuff. But yeah, again, you know, like great job on taking that feedback. Like, you know, instead of using that rounded rectangle, incorporating a letter form, or even around, you know, the image of Garamond himself, incorporating that shape. It's just fantastic. It's just yet another like layer of using the type to drive everything.
Yeah, and then I didn't know how to introduce or start off with the first page, so I did a quote from the designer themselves.
Mhm.
So and then I followed into like the information, designer biography and font history, and then like everything I've made changes is like thanks to your feedback. Like I made sure I tried to like as best as I could make sure like the square element I had next to some of the paragraphs were
Yes.
like aligned
Yes, yes, yeah. I noticed that
aligned.
already here on the third page. Is that there's a consistent placement now of that sort of square bullet that you're using. Um, and yeah, great job also of implementing the font, you know, like the specs, right? The weight,
Yeah.
and the size. You know, you found some very nice natural areas to kind of incorporate those into. that can always be a challenge when we're dealing with a really minimal design like we have here. Sometimes adding those elements after the fact can really kind of throw off the design. But I think, yeah, they just sort of feel very natural in their placement.
Thank you. And then yeah, and then I have like the A and the E to add. So like because in that page I was like explaining it was like explaining the serifs for the E and the A. So I decided to like include that so like the reader could have like a visual example
Yeah,
without
exactly.
having to like look it up themselves or like take a guess.
Yes. No, again, a good decision. We talked on the very first day about understanding who your audience is for this project, and that is certainly like the audience for a type specimen book would be graphic designers. And it's a pretty safe assumption to make that your audience in that case is going to be visual people. I mean, I'd be hard pressed to tell you that I've ever worked with a graphic designer who just wasn't naturally a very visual person. We respond much better when we can see things. I mean, in fact, one of my biggest weaknesses as a human being is my ability to follow written instructions if there are not like visuals to go along with it. Sometimes really like super simple instructions too. My brain just doesn't really work that way. So yeah, to show the visuals, to kind of back up what you're talking about, I think is huge for connecting with the audience.
And then for my type anatomy, I just like looked into like I looked into like more articles that was like dissecting Garamond, so that was like the resources I used.
Mhm.
And then I made the type anatomy. It was really fun. I didn't realize how many like elements go into making font, like because I know like we read about it in the textbook, but unless like seeing it visually like being picked apart,
Yep.
it was like amazing to see how many like little bits and stuff go into type and designing it.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, it literally has literally its own language in
Mm.
describing the anatomy. And the scary thing is, it even goes far beyond like this. And again, it's just, if I'm being quite frank with you and honest, um, even though I've been a graphic designer for over 22, well, no, I've been a teacher for 22 years, been a graphic designer now going on like 27 years. There are several terms that you have listed here, which I have a hard time like remembering off the top of my head. The ones that I use all the time, descender, ascender, X height, waistline, baseline, those types of things, stems. But I think we've talked about this before in class, like the one of the simple ones, like the counter, the inside of a letter form. I forget that constantly. I don't know. I think I literally like whatever brain cell originally like stored that information was long gone, because like I always forget that. I always want to call it a bowl, and it's not a bowl. Like the bowl is like that. Like this would be a bowl, like the inside of a non-closed letter. But yeah, you're just looking at this, like, and this is another easy one, like crotch. Like I forget that this is that's the name for it. Same thing with terminal. So it's always a great refresher for myself to review this terminology. Um, but let's see here. Cool. And just in terms of the actual information, I like that you're going from big picture, sort of talking about things that apply to all type, and then starting to talk about the individual characteristics that make up Garamond and make it different from other typefaces.
Yeah, it was a lot of like information to like sift through. So at least like for me, like it helps to like have things categorized and like separated out.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, because I don't want it to be so much information in one page of like what did I just read.
Yes,
So I
yeah,
like so
exactly.
yeah, there's like yeah, so I have like type characters, so like at the anatomy with that like and then going into the characteristics that make it.
No, for sure. Yeah, I would imagine for both you and Cameron, a big part of this was just not only finding the information, but then like you said, sort of sorting through it and getting it to a um, more or less weeding out the stuff that you just don't have room for in this size of a book. And then once when both of you guys got through all of that, it was, at that point, you haven't even really started designing yet. But that was probably, I mean, dare I say, at least, 30, 40% of the time that you guys put into this is just the organization of the thing from the very beginning, and dealing with all of that information.
Yeah, and then for the formal qualities page, I just like changed this is talking about like the qualities and characteristics more in detail. I just changed the characteristics into a blue bit of bigger text so it stood out because I thought it would be better than like doing a bullet point format
Absolutely.
or something. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. It gets back to what we talked about on the very, very first week of this class when talking about body copy. There's only so much you can do in body copy before it just becomes a visual mess. Oftentimes, it's just a change of color or italicizing the text. So yeah, in this case, leaning heavily on that sort of classic technique of making the type blue. Just it's the way our minds work. When we approach a block of text like this, it allows for some visual anchors and for us to kind of scan through things in case we don't feel like reading the whole thing, or if we're not don't necessarily have the time to read the whole thing, we can skim. And otherwise, if we are taking the time to read through the paragraph, again, from a standpoint of understanding your audience and that they're very visual people, it certainly helps put that emphasis on the things that you, as the designer and the artist, want to put the emphasis on.
Yeah, my thought was just like, let me highlight it for them already.
Yes,
Kind
exactly.
of. And then there's my hand lettering page. That was the most fun to do. That was really fun to do. Um, and then I did not realize how many font variations go into Garamond.
Yeah, there are a surprisingly like large amount, aren't there? I knew that. I mean, I knew of the large majority of these, but I again, like we talked about a few weeks ago, I have to admit there were a few in here that I was not aware of. I did not think that it was going to go on for 4 pages, and it's not even as if you're like putting filler in here to make it go on that long. It's legitimately a very long list of variations.
Yeah, and then it's like I did the font variations and then what is it? I'm glad you suggested to just like go ahead and add more pages so it wasn't so
Yeah.
like tightly together.
Yes.
So I
Yeah.
just separated it by like the families, kind of like one page is just all bold, like different types of Garamond bold. One is like Garamond semi-bold.
Yeah.
And then my last 2 pages is like the family fonts
Yeah.
at their very like basic, like no italics or anything added, just
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, which is sort of a more approachable list of the like the core elements that make up Garamond for sure.
Yeah, I saw like this format from one of the examples. I really liked it, so I kind of like took it.
Cool, cool, cool. It's a very typical thing that you'll see in a lot of spot specimen books. In fact, it's one of the things that makes it feel like an official like spot specimen book is this sort of approach to things. Same thing with like again, like we talked about, like the listing of the sizes and the weights. Um, yeah, I think this really came together very beautifully for you, Kelly. It's going to make for a very strong portfolio piece, top to bottom. It shows just some fantastic design. I mean, first and foremost, the design is gorgeous, but it also shows what I talked about earlier in that it shows that you are capable of finding or taking a subject that is quite lengthy in terms of the amount of information that's there, breaking that down to its core elements and being able to design around that. And that's a skill that always impresses art directors. And that's why, this is just ends up usually being such a strong sort of core portfolio piece for you. And for really any designer who has, sort of gone through that tradition of creating a type specimen book.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, yeah, no problem. Thank you for taking us through that. I really appreciate it. Okay, cool. Karen, yours is up next here. And basically what we're doing here is being that we've critiqued these now, a handful of times, twice really. This is going to be a little bit less of a critique and a little bit more of a presentation. So I'd love for, and certainly if I have suggestions for you, I'll throw them out there, but I'd love for you to kind of, as I'm scrolling down through these pages, I'd love for you to kind of just walk us through the project. There's nothing necessarily specific that you have to talk about. It could be, something that worked out particularly well, or something that was challenging for you, or just, maybe some of the design decisions that you made from page to page.
Okay.
But yeah, here, let me zoom in a little bit for us. In fact, I'm going to reset my zoom. Let's go actual size. There we go. Okay. Cool. So Cam, take us through like some of the things that that you did here on the cover.
Well, for my cover, I kind of wanted it to, because obviously the tagline was kind of like, yeah, it's a bit bold. So obviously I wanted to kind of go with a bunch of larger, more bold text
Mhm.
overall, and just kind of have it wrap, or seem like it kind of wraps around the entire cover. Kind of
Yeah.
wanted it to make it seem like space was filled up
Mhm.
and just kind of incorporated. So I tried matching a lot of the borders and what is it, my grid together,
Mhm.
matching it so they end at the same spots like you gave during one of your critiques.
Mhm.
It looks like I think it worked out pretty well.
Yeah, I think by
Only
and large,
problem
I
is
think
that
the grid here is pretty solid. I do think the bottom A does kind of break that grid. If I were to offer you any suggestions on this page between now and the time that you graduate and you're putting together your portfolio, I would, drop in a guideline that follow, because the A and the A on this top feature and this feature line up really nicely. But if we were to drop a guideline down here, I do feel like this A here kind of breaks outside of that, versus top margin looks really good. This one looks good. Obviously, this one down here looks good too. That would be a small tweak that you would do. And I would say, just use your transform tool. I generally don't transform type, but it's such a small tweak. It's probably easiest just to grab that transform tool. And the reason why I'm suggesting that is that we want to respect the bottom line, like the bottom is actually lined up perfectly with this Futura. So we want to shrink in from like this top corner so that it maintains this and this line. So we're shrinking from here. And again, it's probably going to be, I mean, if I were to kind of guesstimate, I'd say we're probably bumping in a good 1/4 inch to maybe 5/8 of an inch there. But that would be the only thing I would recommend grid wise with this. Then Cam, something that I had mentioned when I was reviewing this on the last recording. I don't know if you got an opportunity to watch that or not. The pink box that is in the middle of these pages, I'm not sure if that's just like a grid or a guideline that you dropped in there, but that would definitely be something that if it's actually a part of the design, I would definitely take that out of the design. I think that it adds just some clutter to it.
I don't know why it did that. I thought I turned off all my grids and everything.
Yeah. I almost wonder then, I'm wondering if in InDesign, if it is just a blank like text field or text frame or even an image frame that has like a 1 pixel stroke or border on it. I suspect it might be that and not actually a guide or a grid. And in which case it's, it'd be very easy to remove. But yeah, that's definitely an element that before portfolio that you want to remove as well.
Mhm.
But like we talked about back in the beginning, I love how bold and how striking this arrangement is. I think it's just just a perfect intro to Futura as a font and sort of this very bold presentation that you are setting us up for throughout the entire book. Cool. So inside here is page 1. You know what I'm going to actually do, Cam? I'm going to download this, and I should be able to view it in a side-by-side format rather than the Google preview. So give me just a moment. There we go. There we go. Okay.
One of the only like other problems I had was trying to find on some pages fitting in the actual font description, like
Yeah.
what the font I used on the
Mhm.
pages.
Sure, sure.
So on some, I hate saying on a couple where the pages are more crowded, I didn't include them.
Okay. Yeah,
But
I
yeah, for
think
this,
I think that like I like the inclusion of it here, here, and here. I think like here, I'm gonna actually, this is gonna be, obviously I don't have your layers. So this is not necessarily the best way to do this, but it'll still allow me to do it. I'm just gonna open this up in Photoshop and show you just a quick suggestion on this. Let's see. So I'm going to actually open up page, this would be what, page 2 and page 3. Oops, so of course this is going to come in, since we're doing it in Photoshop like this, I'm going to have to just add the backgrounds real quick, no big deal. So yeah, this is, I would say that this this line is definitely coming from a text box then, if it's coming in here as well. Okay, so just a couple quick thoughts on like the presentation of like the font names. So one thing I would definitely recommend is also adding the font size. That's a big part of the specimen books, so that the idea is if a designer sees this and likes your typographical arrangement, they can look then and find the exact font name and the exact font size to replicate that in one of their own designs. So that would be something too that I would add to these, and that'll only take you a few moments again between now and portfolio. But what I would, here, let me see, let me find preview. Okay, where I was going to go with this was to say that like in an area like this, I feel like we could make this work by opening up like the bottom here just a touch. In that, where I was going to say is the type here doesn't necessarily, and again, bear with me guys, because since I don't have the layers, I'm just kind of like hacking this together by copying and pasting. Just simply bringing this up just a bit, I think alleviates some of that tension that we have down here. The other thing is that you got to keep in mind that that Futura is a very clean and very easy typeface to read. So I think it's entirely possible that what you can consider is taking just the size of this down. In most type specimen books, those descriptions are very small. And again, since Futura is so easy to read at a small size, I think that would work. And the final thing I would say is for ones that are on the bottom, I would probably respect the grid line that that happens with the folio or the page number. Same thing like here on the side, like of this one. I think that I think this could not only come down a little bit in size, but potentially also respect the the grid. To the standpoint of we could even probably establish that grid up here as well. But the thing about going ultra small with like this type is that, and again, also including the size, is that we will definitely start to understand. You're basically training the viewer to know that anytime they see very small type like that, that it's just descriptive type that has to do with the describing the font that is next to it, and not necessarily something of terrible importance that they would actually read as like body copy or headlines or anything like that. And of course, I do like that. I'm getting a program here right now, but I do like actually that you had had it tighter. Mine's kind of floating away there a little bit, but yeah, shoot, it's not going to let me do this right now. But nuts. Anyway, so yeah, just a quick thought on the handling of those. Hey, bud. So yeah, do consider that. So, you're gonna have to go in there and touch all of those anyway for portfolio in terms of adding a point size. So while you're doing it, you can kind of like figure out exactly what size you want one of those to be and just stay consistent with the size on all of those. Okay. But again, one of the things that I love about this project, Cam, is just, I mean, you're doing some things that I think are potentially out of your normal comfort zone. Like you've got some pretty bold, pretty crazy typographical layouts in this, which I love. So, you know, the things that I'm commenting on, I think right now are the minor things. They're very easy to make tweaks to.
Obviously, yeah, I have the based on shapes. I made the triangle. I made this one. I made it actually like an isosceles triangle.
Cool.
Luckily, it was one of the things because the Constitution. Because I remember when I originally made it, it was a equilateral triangle.
Yeah, I know exactly. Did you get an opportunity to try what I mentioned last class during the presentations or the critiques? I think that something that could really work for this page is going with, instead of the white background, going with a pink background. I know that you're alternating between white and black on all these. There were 2 pages that I mentioned in the video that I would strongly recommend going with pink background. So one of your combos would be pink and black on one page, and then another page, so it didn't seem like such an outlier, would be one would be white and one would be pink. I think this would be an awesome candidate for a pink background. And what that would allow you to do is use shapes that don't necessarily have strokes around them. Obviously the word shapes would have to be changed. You know, that could just be changed to white. All of the other things that could remain black. But that's something I think that would really add some, I don't know, just like another bold punch to the project.
Because yeah, I did add a pink background on another page, but now that you're saying it, yeah, if I add one in there, it'll make it actually look like it wasn't kind of like an outlier on one page. So,
totally. Yes, exactly. Absolutely. All right, cool. Let's see here. Yeah, this is another one of your layouts, which I'm just a huge fan of. I do like the tweak that you made on this page as well. I kind of felt like it was it got a little bit crazy down here on the bottom. I think you've restored some nice order to it.
Mhm.
And again, like this is a pretty bold decision in and of itself to have, these, one layout with like horizontal type, another with the vertical type. And we can't get away with this in a lot of projects, but I think it's, within a type specimen book, I think you obviously, you got the opportunity to do that. I'm glad that you took that opportunity. The pink box in this case, I think is maybe showing us something that could also maybe be tweaked. Maybe consider, it looks like we could probably benefit from a grid line that all of this type could start on. It looks like this line of type is kind of bumped in a little bit. Maybe this one's an extra pixel or 2 in as well. Not that that they all have to align on the stem of the Y, but rather like on the, on the the furthest most point down there. Let's see how we. Awesome, cool. So you took care of, there was some stretching that was happening here on some of these before. It looks like you got that taken care of. Very good.
Yeah, it's pretty much just, yeah, again,
Mhm.
this one's kind of like my historical, like the what feature is kind of like used for in some cases, which was a lot of its advertising because of its like nice bold heavy weight.
Mhm. This book cover always intrigues me too. Like I've seen this probably half a dozen times in my life, and every time I look at that, I think to myself, boy, I just need to buy that book. And I'm having that moment again. Like I've actually had it 3 times now as I've looked through your project. But yeah, let's see here.
Obviously, I fixed it up the best I could with the perfect letter form. I tried to get everything more centered and lined up.
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. I think this I almost feel like this page here could benefit from an addition of some pink.
Okay.
And I don't necessarily, I mean, it could be the 2 vertical lines of the S's. It could be the large S itself. I mean, this might also be one, I mentioned earlier that you could have, pink background on two, but there's no reason we couldn't have it on a third page. This could even be a pink background with like a big white S in it, and then all the rest of the type is black. But I would almost say, like, the other thing that I'm sort of like looking at and debating is, I would either bring the width of the perfect letter form out to match, essentially the grid line that's happening here with the S's. Or I would be curious what this would look like, Cam, if it actually didn't have those two lines of S's. I don't know on this page that those are actually needed. So that's, if you have not tried that yet, maybe try that. Just turn those layers off and see.
Okay.
Because they're very much kind of pulling us in the opposite direction of like this S and the perfect letter form. And I don't necessarily mind in cases where we're getting pulled away from things, because that's obviously a mechanism, a visual mechanism that we can use as artists, but they're not necessarily bringing us to anywhere that is relevant. Like if I follow the S and down here and then bring these up, I'm kind of being dropped off into an area. If I follow them directly down, they don't really line up with perfect letter form. So yeah, I would almost say, I would almost pull them out and see what happens.
Right.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, that looks fantastic.
That was, this was the one page I kind of remembered to change to pink.
Yeah.
And now that, I will probably go back through when it comes down to portfolio and change some of these other pages.
Yeah, cool. Okay. And then when you do get to the point where you have shrunk these down, again, just sort of, well, actually, I think we talked about that. I was gonna say, like, this definitely has to come up, but I think we actually talked about it with the numbers, the folios. In fact, Cam, what I would really recommend, I think it's most obvious here on this page, we want to get those page numbers potentially aligned across the whole project.
Okay.
Like the 12 and the 13 are definitely off on these. The other option would be that they dramatically change position from page to page, which I don't necessarily know is going to benefit you any, but it's one or the other. Generally, we don't necessarily want them to be off by just a small margin like that.
Okay. Yeah.
Oh, cool. Yeah, this looks fantastic again with the pink sort of woven in there. In fact, I would say I would sort of lean on that technique and also weave a little bit of pink into this.
Okay.
It could end up being like the Bye Man or the Damn This Really Sucks. Maybe it ends up being that, because like I kind of like how, like, the very beginning, you've got like when you're being a little bit more casual with your verbiage here, like, yeah, but it's a bit bold. We could potentially, this is probably like the most casual line here.
Yeah.
And maybe that's all that, maybe it's just that little bit. Although this may or may not work, but I expect it might. Like, this might be a happy accident thing. Like when I highlight this and surround it with like a blue box, I wonder what this would look like if it were highlighted with a pink box, I don't know. Just kind of throwing that out there.
Yeah.
And
then obviously
come to the final page there. Okay. Cool. Yeah, Cam, I think give yourself like how many more semesters do you have for like your last semester when you graduate?
This is my last semester.
Okay, cool. So you're in portfolio, or probably already had portfolio and are basically like tidying it up then at this point. So yeah, I'm glad we went through it from that sort of perspective. Are you taking a portfolio class right now?
Yes, I am.
Okay, cool. So yeah, do consider the suggestions there.
Yeah.
I think if you were to like rewatch this portion of the video and kind of dive in, I would imagine you'd be able to make those tweaks to this project in a single night. It's not like anything like that needs to like be radically redone. It's just a matter of I think more just some small house cleaning than anything else.
Okay.
All right. Cool, guys. Congrats. You made it through the type specimen book. Again, for graphic design students, that is a long-standing tradition in many programs, and quite a beefy project. I mean, if I'm being honest with you, it takes a lot, but it is usually worth it. Again, if done right, it just ends up being just such a nice, impressive piece. All right, cool. So let's talk a little bit about what else we have on the agenda here. Let's take a look at the week 5 list. So my apologies, my dog is back. I think a package was just delivered to my house, which is always bark fest over here. So we're going to dig into a little bit of type anatomy talk that kind of goes specific with sans serif and serif typefaces. And I want to talk a little bit about what makes different typefaces expressive, guys, from a real detailed standpoint of minutia. There are a few tasks that we are going to dig into over the course of this week. One is going to be an exercise I'm going to give you guys at the end of class that is going to introduce you to a phenomenal resource, just a website that will allow you to identify typefaces that you don't know the names of. I also want to introduce the typography analysis project. It's a much smaller project in scope than what you guys just did. It's literally a 2-page spread. So having just completed an 18-page project, a 2-pager should seem like a walk in the park. There are a number of examples here. I'll come back to these in just a moment after we've taken a look at that project sheet. And in fact, maybe we'll do that now. Maybe I'll just kind of use that as my segue to talking about that project. Let me keep this page, open and open up a new tab here. Yeah, let's dig in. Since we just put to rest our last project, let's introduce this new project. I'll show you guys some examples, and I think at that point we'll take a quick break, and then we can talk about the first of the 2 lectures that I'm going to do this week with you guys, and then we'll wrap up with the identity website. So your next project is a typography analysis project. Here's the assignment sheet for it, and there are a number of bullet points that are examples of the way you can go with this. That kind of provide a number of options. Keep in mind though, when I get to talking about these are options. These are not all the things you have to do, okay? You'll see some nice visual examples of this as well. But the purpose of this project is really to gain a deeper understanding of the nature of letter forms by closely scrutinizing their design structure. The assignment itself is geared to so basically it's an advanced typography class that involves the design analysis of typefaces. And this project is really going to be purely typographical in nature. It may contain images or photographs, but it can absolutely be done entirely with type. Very much like the last project, and even the last project before that. Before you decide whether to include images or photographs, I would almost say, pick a design style that you want to establish first. Take sort of a portfolio-centric approach to this project. Ask yourself, what design styles have you already worked with in projects that are going to go into your portfolio? And then ask yourself a follow-up question of, what design styles have you always wanted to design for that you just haven't? Use this as a potential project to fill a gap within your portfolio. So what you are going to be doing is a structural analysis of a serif and sans serif or sans serif typeface. Really, it's actually, this is sort of a bit of a typo here. It is an analysis between 2 typefaces. It'll say this many times in here, and you'll see examples. But essentially, an analytical comparison between 2 typefaces that are sort of in the same family. Okay, this project works out better when you have typefaces that are close in nature. Okay, so for example, looking at the structural difference between 2 weights of either a single typeface like Universe, or comparing, doing a comparison between the same weights of 2 different typefaces, let's say Universe versus Helvetica. Okay, so again, you can do this with a single typeface, but oftentimes you've got a little bit more to play with if you're doing it between 2 very similar typefaces. So again, that kind of breaks it down here. So this could be an analytical comparison between two typefaces which appear to the layman to be identical. So I just mentioned like Helvetica and Universe, or Grotesque and Arial, or Garamond and Saban, Palatino and Aldus. It would not be helpful to try and compare typefaces that are stylistically quite different. In fact, if you go with typefaces that are radically different from each other, this project is just not even doable with 2 pages. It ends up being, there's just too much to describe. What we're looking for is trying to describe subtle differences between typefaces. Another way you could go as well would be a structural comparison between certain typefaces from one designer. So for example, you could take typefaces from Adrian Frugier, Herman Zapp or Eric Gill that have family resemblances. So these are the 5 like ways that you could approach this project. You're not doing all 5 of these. You're essentially just picking one of these ways to tackle this project. Okay. So some of the things that you could compare between these, in fact, here, before I show you all this big list, it'll make a heck of a lot more sense, I think, if I show you guys some examples of what students have done in the past, because then I think all of this, you'll be able to visually reference with some stuff. Okay? So let me show you what this project potentially can look like. These 7 examples vary in look and in feel, okay? And they cover sort of the full range of the different like 5 ways you can go about this project. Although one of them, I'll say, one of them probably picks typefaces that are a little bit too different from each other. But I do like the overall design of it. So for what it's worth, it's included here as well. So these are all visually expressive, and guys, these were done on like an 11 by 17. So it's essentially, it fits a double page spread, 2 pages side by side. Okay. So this is one example. And what this example does is it overlays letter forms on top of one another. This is one that I would say out of all of them probably uses typefaces that are a little bit too different in nature, because we're dealing with like sans serif and serif. But I do feel like overall, it's a really nice design. I know that this is kind of hard to see here. Let's see, can I open this? Let me download it and so we can actually like see it a little larger. You guys obviously can download these as well on your own computers. Oh, shoot, looks like that's the resolution on this one, unfortunately. Let's see here. This is another similar in nature as well, and these are examples where you've got comparison of typefaces that are overlaid on top of one another, just using opacity. The rest all start to kind of break away from that and show other ways that you can compare things. We do have a couple examples of like one that is just the outline versus one that's solid. That would be another way that you could show comparisons. In this case, we're taking a look at like the different angles on the serifs of these 2 different typefaces. So yet another, you'll see like with these specific letters, you'll see these like listed in that list of ways you could go about describing these typefaces. And then the lecture today will also provide you guys with lots of terminology that you guys can use. So in this case, we've got both opacity and color, and we're seeing again a wide range of variation between like different weights and whatnot. So this is a little bit less of opacity, a little bit more like side-by-side comparisons. This is used what they're calling a circle analysis. You'll see that on also in the assignment sheet as one of the options as well. So let me bounce back to that assignment sheet, and now we can kind of talk about some of these things. So some of the structural and comparative considerations that you can make. Again, you're not responsible for comparing all of these things. This just provides options for you. You can potentially just pick a single option maybe two, depending on how simple the option is, and use those to complete this assignment. So the shape of the serifs or other terminals, like what is essential to the structure, and are they perfectly symmetrical or absolutely identical between, instances? Are they bracketed slightly or not at all? Some common comparisons of letters having similar forms, comparing H's, M's, N's, U's, or comparing a B, a D, a P, a G, or an A, a V, a Y. You can see all of these, they're kind of broken up by commas. Those are all groups of letters that you could use to compare. The relationship between the H, M, N, U counters to those of the B, D, P, Q, and O. The counter of the M is always a bit smaller than those that are present in the H and U. So all of these are mechanisms. I'm not necessarily going to read through all of these with you guys. I'll put you guys to sleep, but I'll put myself to sleep as well if I sit here and read all of these. These are all options for you guys, okay? I mean, just some of the other ones that are kind of vary from those that are maybe worth pointing out. What's the relationship between the typeface cap height and X height of an ascender and a descender? We'll talk about that actually during our lecture today a little bit. Are the figures the same height as the caps or slightly smaller? In Helvetica, for example, the figures are about 90% of the height of the caps. Once we go through the lecture, which really kind of breaks down a lot of these concepts, I think that also will provide a helpful guide. But ultimately, again, you should be able to complete this assignment by picking one or two of these bullet points to use as sort of the subject for what you're doing. Obviously, then you'll want to. So essentially, what you're going to be doing is picking one of these five, to use as the framework, and then using one or two of these. Okay, so it looks like a much longer assignment sheet than it really is. It's just because there's so many options that are present here. Okay. The due dates on this are listed, let's see here, in the week 5 checklist here. So on Tuesday of next week, you'll present to me your concept, your 2-page concept, done in InDesign, or you could potentially do it in Illustrator as well if you wanted to. There might be beneficial, depending on what you're doing, to do it in Illustrator, like especially for ones that have lots of shapes. It might be beneficial to work in Illustrator, but I'll let you guys choose which you want to do, which program you want to do. Oops. Let's get back on track to where I was. Let's see. Well, let's bounce on back. All right, so I was here showing you guys due dates. So next week, March 8th, is when your concept is due. You've got a fairly quick turnaround time then for the revised version of this project, which would be due the following Thursday, just 2 days later. So neither one of the components of this project is due for next class. We do have one thing that's due next class. I'll talk about this after our lecture and after we've gotten through our break. We'll talk a bit about that. That is going to be a type ID exercise using, again, a website. That is the next project you guys will be working on, as well as its timeline. Why don't we take a quick break? I'd love to go through the lecture with you guys next, because that's got a lot of techniques and things I think you could potentially use in this project. And then I'm going to just open it up for questions that you guys might have with regards to this. Okay. All right, I'm going to go ahead and mute my audio. We'll take a 10-minute break, and we'll reconvene, let's say at 4:35. So let's see here. So yeah, guys, I'll meet you back here in 10. All right, guys, let's jump back in here for round two. We should have a quieter session or part two here. I realized what was going on. I left my front window open to let some of that nice air in, and my dog was having a field day, barking at every rando who was walking past the house. So now that that's shut, I'm hoping we have a little bit less of a distracting session here. Okay, let's see. Two things that I want to take care of here during round two of class, and that is getting into the lecture for today. This is available for you guys as well. There's actually two. We're going to do one today. We'll do one next class. These are long, so I'm going to break these up over the course of two classes. So just a couple quick thoughts on these. There is, as I mentioned a few times now, they're long. There will be some information here that I'm going to skip over. These are as much as important, I guess, in terms of how do I phrase this. The purpose of this document is not only to inform you guys about like serif fonts, but also to provide as a resource for you guys for the assignment that you're going to be beginning that we just talked about. So there's a lot of information. And that's why ultimately I think I'm not going to read this all verbatim for you guys, because there's a lot of minutiae here that just doesn't quite frankly make for like the most engaging and interesting lecture. But a lot of this info is invaluable for that small stuff you'd be looking for information on your project. So realistically, the large majority of like the terminology that you guys would be using in this type analysis project is going to be found in one of these two lectures. So it really kind of depends on whether or not you pick serif or sans serif typefaces to use for this. But so just kind of keep that in mind. So if you see me skipping around, that's sort of the reason why, again, I don't want to necessarily put all of us to sleep with this. But I do think that it is certainly informative and will again, provide for a pretty valuable tool for you guys. All right, so this is our guide to serif fonts. So, as we've talked about, guys, over the course of the semester, there are many categories of type. And really, these are based on the ways in which letters are drawn and how we've changed over time. One of the more broad categories is serif type. We've also talked about like sans serif being a major category, and then like display type being yet another. But there are many, many variations of serif type, as I think you guys are probably start to figure out. I mean, just looking at the books you guys just did, like just within Garamond, we can see a variety of variations. I think that's redundant, isn't it? Variety of variations. A lot of variations just within that one typeface, let alone all of the different serif typefaces. So serifs, these are type forms that are originally created with the tools of the goldsmith, wherein capital letters were based on chiseled inscriptional capitals. So, way back, as we've sort of talked about and read about in the past, when letter blocks were formed, these things had to be chiseled. And even going back before then, when you're talking about like type on buildings, going back to like the days of like the Greeks and the Romans, talking about like letter forms that were chiseled. And those serifs were very much a necessity in chiseling letters, so that like the stones kept their integrity. So the natural finishing strokes, made with a chisel or engraving tools are called serifs. As we've also discussed, they tend to work out particularly well for like print-based, like large areas of body copy to establish like those strong, like baselines. Okay. So serifs, as we've talked about many times, those little sort of feet on the bottom of our letter forms. There are a number of different terms that I'm going to provide the definitions with that you might find very valuable for the project you're about to dig into, including all of these here over the next few pages. Baseline we've talked about way back, like on, really from like the first week on. But the lines essentially in which our type sits on, that invisible line, is called a baseline. Some letters have elements that descend below those. We know those as descenders. Some curved letters actually dip slightly below the baseline at their lowest points. It kind of depends on the typeface. Some do, most do, some don't. X height. X height is the, while an O and an E might dip below the baseline, lowercase x always sits flat on the line. We measure the height of the letter X in order to gauge the overall height of the lowercase letters, thus creating the name X height. Greater X heights make for more legible text at smaller sizes, generally found in newspaper. So again, text that is not as squished or not as extended would be the technical term, are generally much more readable. You can see varying X heights here between different sizes of type. So obviously, the larger the size of the font, the larger the X height. As you guys are well aware of now, we've got some examples there of some ascenders and descenders. Note that the T is almost never as high as an I or an H. T is only just taller than an X and an E in most cases. Again, there's obviously variations. Okay, elegance versus legibility. As a general rule, lower X heights with longer ascenders and descenders make for more elegant looking text. However, when space is a premium and smaller type size is necessary, it's time to go for a larger X height and greater legibility. Both of the above bullets use type at 36 points, but obviously different fonts display differently. So you can see here, again, this is type with larger X heights, and it's got much, much greater legibility. Doesn't mean that this is hard to read per se, but clearly this is a great example of how this is certainly just more legible. Okay, so we've talked about tracking. I occasionally will use the word kerning, and I think I gave you guys a disclaimer earlier in the semester that kerning technically is the spacing in between individual letters, not the whole like word. Tracking is actually the term. So, we're talking about something you may have heard me call kerning over the course of the semester from time to time. But tracking is the amount of horizontal space taken up by a font, depends both in the physical width of the characters and the spacing between them. Adjustment of the spaces between the letters will allow for more words per line, but at the cost of legibility. And you can see here, the tracking is much tighter here. We've got letter forms that are actually touching in some cases. And the legibility does suffer a little bit. Now, at larger font sizes, we can get away with it. But body copy, we have to be really, really careful about tightening up that, that letter spacing for that tracking. So beware of letter spacing with lowercase to in some cases, expanding or contracting lowercase letters to some old school designers is a sin. Letter spacing, though, for uppercase is something that is generally appropriate. I love contrasting really loose letter spacing and really tight letter spacing with all caps. I think that, especially when you start mixing up different weights as well, you can create really strong typographical hierarchy just by modifying letter spacing and weights alone, and still, working with the same font, same color, same size. Just those two things can go a long way in establishing a really, really strong hierarchy. Okay. All right, some additional spacing. Leading is the typographical term for line spacing, so literally the spacing in between lines of type. This is originally referred to the physical lines of lead that was put into composed type in order to create space. So imagine, old school, typesetting. They would use lines like spacers essentially of lead in between those lines of type. They're hard to see, but you can kind of, yeah, I think in this case, we're not actually seeing any in these. They're actually just seeing the default size. But if you wanted to increase that, you could actually put in little bars of lead in between these lines of type. The optimal amount of line spacing will depend on the X height, descender, and ascender length, and the point size of the type. There's not necessarily a magical formula, but there are some guidelines, okay? So 12-point type with a 14 spacing looks tight. 12-point type with a 20-point spacing may be hard to read on longer lines. These are generalities, you know, so if you were to kind of read through the lines there, the suggestion of like 16-point letter spacing might look pretty good with 12-point type. And I would love to say that that's always the case, but it really truly does depend on the typeface itself. But almost always, you want to make sure that your line spacing is definitely larger in point size than the size of the type itself. So 12-point, you definitely want to have more than 12-point letter spacing. But again, the number is going to be relative to what's happening with the typeface itself. So here's some leading examples. This is 14-point type on 14-point letter spacing, and it's tight. I mean, it's legible. I can read that, but it's tight. And if I had to read a lot of paragraphs of that, I would not be happy, especially where like ascenders and descenders, like right here, start to clash with that P and that F are. Here's 14-point on 16-point spacing. This is certainly much more comfortable. You can see here a descender is not actually touching a cap, so that's a good sign, although we do have an ascender and a descender touching there. Here's 14-point on 20-point line spacing. Pretty comfortable. For large bodies of type, you know, pages and pages, this would probably be pretty optimal. But by the time that we start getting to like 24-point spacing, it might be a little bit too much, you know, at this point. That might actually sort of aid in it being difficult to kind of keep track what line you're on when you're ready to jump down to the next line of type. And again, these are all just examples. This changes quite a bit depending on the typeface. So no, unfortunately, no magic numbers there that I can give you. Okay, another definition. Stroke. So early type cutters were imitating either pen strokes or chiseled inscriptions. The first types therefore closely resembled handwriting, with strokes apparently made with the split nib of the quill pen. So let's see, do we have an example of that? I will pull up an example for you guys on that, because that I think is difficult to describe without seeing it. Variation, we've talked about this actually quite a bit this semester in terms of like variation in like the like how the printed type sits on a page. So stroke variation adds light and shade to a printed page, aiding the process of legibility and making individual letters more distinctive. So over the centuries, type became less like hand-drawn letters, and stroke variation became more and more less extreme, depending on the fashion and design aesthetic. So we've talked about how line variation in a typeface can aid in its readability. In general, when you have a lot of variation of line weight, you can use those typefaces, but in general, we want to stick with those things only being used for headers. By the time that you've got like a lot of variation in line weight, if you're using body copy with those typefaces, it can be kind of tough on the eyes. You know, it's not to say that we can't have line variation. Again, like looking at the sample type specimen book earlier of Paramount, there is actually quite a bit of line variation, but it still reads pretty well at a smaller size. So, you know, again, like a lot of things, it sort of depends on the typeface that's being used. So color is a term that's referred to like more so when we're talking about like the printed page. The word of color refers to the overall shade of gray created by a chosen type. The heavier the typeface, the heavier the overall color will be. The lighter the typeface, the lighter the shade of gray would be used. So like, a good way to kind of think about this is stepping back from a page. I've seen a lot of like folks in the past like squint to basically kind of like gauge like what the overall like shade of the page is. Again, lighter typefaces overall will create a very light feeling page. Heavier typefaces, like what we're seeing here, for example, you can imagine a page full of type like this would be a very dark shade of gray. There's not a lot of space. You know, it's almost kind of hard to get this concept across when we're looking at white type on a black background. You know, typically we're analyzing black type on a white background, but that's essentially what I'm referring to there. Okay. So figures, the numbers in a font often vary, are often very distinctive. Ranging figures run across the top of the baseline. Old style figures include some numbers that dip below the baseline. You know, Garamond was a typeface. I got kind of keep coming back to that, but that is a version of a font that has old style figures, which individually can be fine, especially in the middle of body copy, but can be quite distracting when we're just looking at like numerical values. It just ends up looking very, very disorganized. Old style figures. So figures, ranging figures are best for columns or numbers. So ranging essentially again, like this. So when you're dealing with like information in columns, like tabular data inside of a spreadsheet or inside of a table in a website, ranging figures are best for those. But old styles definitely look more elegant in blocks of like paragraphs of type body copy. So this part of the lecture gets into quite a bit of dates. Some of this I will read verbatim for you guys, but it gets pretty heavy in terms of a history lesson. So I'm going to ease off on reading like page after page of this, or this lecture will go on for like 2 days. Okay. But the Roman alphabet is so called because the earliest Renaissance types around the 15th century had capital letters based on inscriptions on Trajan's column in Rome, going all the way back to 113 AD. You'll see an example of that in here actually. Lowercase letters were based on a form of 19th to 12th century handwriting called the, I'm going to totally botch the pronunciation here, but it's the Carolingian minuscule. So you can see examples of that here. We've got like uppercase and lowercase. It's very much like writing that would take place on paper or parchment is where you would see this type of print, like uppercase and lowercase, versus chiseled type is almost always all uppercase. Here's an example of type chiseled onto a column. So various examples of type here from different time periods. So if you guys are on this assignment specifically are picking a serif typeface, I'm going to recommend that you go through some of these pages to see if your typeface is referenced. Each of these pages reference specific typefaces, contemporary typefaces. And I think that this could help you potentially in your paper. There's going to be more. It's not just those two. There's definitely going to be more. I'll read this one. I think this is valuable across the spectrum of type. So italics are a third alphabet based on a popular style of cursive handwriting used in the Vatican. And these were really originally like used to save paper in cheap printer books because they were more compact. You can just fit more type on a page. Okay. But there were no italics capitals. So standard Roman capitals were used. Let's see examples here. These next several pages will go through eventually establishing like the angle of strokes on a number of common or popular serif typefaces. So, note that the thin strokes, the areas like on an O that have the thinnest line weight. You can also, you'll notice this on Q's and E's potentially as well. But the angle in this is referred. Let's see. Sorry, I totally lost my train of thought here. Well, here, the next several pages, I know definitely like talk about like this principle here. You'll see a number of them and how as letter forms have become much more modern, how this angle will become less and less steep. You'll see examples of that. So later old style types had more upright design. Old style types lasted hundreds of years, moving from north from Italy through France, Holland, and England. And most current reworkings of these liberties were the original design. So here we go. Here are, you'll notice here, like the stroke here in the E is actually horizontal, although the O still has a pronounced slat. Stroke in Garamond is a little bit more upright. This is one that always kind of makes me, I guess, chuckle. It took until the 16th century in France before someone used italic type alongside with Roman type for contrast and emphasis. I mean, the printed letter had existed for quite some time before somebody decided to actually do that, which is kind of wild. So, you know, type by the 1600s, you're starting to see much more upright strokes that are present here. The old Caslon, much more modern typeface, and again, fairly heavy amount of contrast, but very upright strokes. Okay, so transitional and modern are a couple more definitions that we should understand. Transitionals are so called because they represent a clear stage in the evolution of type from old style to later modern types. Modern in type design refers not to the age we live in, but the specific style of type produced in France and Italy later in the 18th century. So examples here, we've got like Baskerville. So in this case, the bar and the E is now sharply defined. In contrast, between the thick and thin strokes is very pronounced. O is upright. The type is now very clearly engraved rather than drawn, with narrower letters allowing for more text per page. You know, fast forward another 80 years, and Didot, like Baskerville, is an upright design. It is now the contrast between thick and thin strokes is exaggerated. So a much heavier, you know, like line weight contrast. I mean, very thin, very thick. Bodoni, then about the same time, 1800. Let's see, display typefaces. So by the time that we are starting to get into, you know, modern, much more modern typefaces with like poster design, magazines design, is when you actually start to see like display typefaces coming into play. So in talking, and you know, in this case, these examples, we see many examples of serif typefaces that sort of appear to be hand drawn, you know, from like the H, the M, the G, the S, the E here. Let's see. So some later developments, the moderns of Didot and Bodoni are considered to be the pinnacle of letterpress printing. Later versions of serif Roman types needed to take account for high-speed presses. In the digital age, every era of serif type is still well served, with recent originals available alongside. Slab serifs. We've talked a little bit about slab serifs. You're seeing some examples right here with essentially like very little to no variation in the treatment of the serif. So one solution to the fragility of modern fonts was to thicken the serifs, making them more slab-like than hair-like. The 19th century's slab serifs are still quite common. You know, like Rockwell would be a typeface that comes to mind right away in terms of nice modern slab serif typeface. Exaggerating the slabs creates distinctive display typefaces. Claridon is a great one. So heavier slab serif, frequently used for signage and even wanted posters in the Old West. E in this case, one of the distinguishing features would be that the E almost has a completely closed loop there. Here's a typeface called, so we've got essentially some slab serif exaggerate, way exaggerate the, like the slabs in this case. Way Out West is a recent reworking. I would almost call this, I mean, this to me is sort of a combination of a slab serif, but also you could probably classify this as a display typeface as well. So Joanna, designed in 1930 by Eric Gill of Gill Sans fame. It's an elegant slab serif designed as a book type with a characteristically narrow italic. O has an upward slant, and the lowercase d has Gill's trademark hump. Again, a number of these are going to be listed here, sort of sprinkled throughout. So now the type is no longer based on hot metal. The whole history of type is available digitally. While many current designers currently favor sans serif designs, traditional book types have really never gone away. Legibility is often claimed that sans serif fonts are more legible than serifs, but you know, I don't know. I would argue it depends. It really truly depends. I think in terms of single words or headlines, I think perhaps that serif or sans serif fonts are more legible, but for me, even though sans serif fonts are clear, I don't know that they're necessarily more legible. I kind of feel like in a book or a magazine, I actually personally prefer serif typefaces. Again, just helping to establish that horizontal, baselines like they do with those serifs, I think makes a huge difference for me. I don't necessarily really like to read like more than a page or two of type if it is in sans serif. And that might be because of like this next bullet point here. In reality, people prefer what's familiar. So for myself, growing up, primarily still in the age of books and magazines, I was more, I grew up on serif type. I mean, I don't know, perhaps as we continue to migrate more and more towards digital media, that may change. We might get to a point where most folks are more comfortable reading sans serif. Let's see. Okay, we are getting there, guys. I know, like I mentioned, this is a long one. Again, we've got some additional just sort of characteristic pages here. We've got a couple in a row. So for any of you who are using any of these typefaces, again, on this particular project, Times, Valentino, Minion, Stone, these could be wonderful examples of information you could include in the current project. All right, and finally, a word about italics. So the first italics are based on cursive handwriting, created as a standalone book types. In the 16th century, italics were paired with Roman types, becoming more script-like and more related to the Roman form. The characteristics of italics is a forward slope and a single story A. In terms of choosing it, italics are to be a major feature in the printed work. Consider choosing the font based on the preference for the italics. That's an excellent tip there. We almost never consider how the italics font will look until you get to that point where you decide to use it. But if italics are going to be a major feature, definitely consider the font based on the preference for the italics first. And then some italics make a special feature of the ampersand. I've seen some pretty wild ampersands being used for certain typefaces in italics form. You can see a number of variations there for ampersands. Like Castle's got an extremely elaborate ampersand. Okay. All right, guys, that was a long one, as I had mentioned in the beginning. So hopefully, again, if you end up using some of these typefaces that are outlined in here, it can aid you a bit in the just in the process of gathering information for the type analysis project. With that, let's circle around back to this project. And I wanted to just ask you guys, now that you've seen some examples and we've gone through, some tech specs and analysis, any questions on the text analysis project?
No, really, no.
No questions.
Cool. And again, don't be afraid, guys, to lean on the examples that I provided. And again, those examples are right here in this first link under week 5. Clicking on there, we've got our sort of bullet pointed outline of the week. You'll find those 7 examples right here. All right, that's going to take us to the final portion of class today. And that is the exercise that you will find right here. Very basic exercise, guys. And that you are going to download this 4-page PDF file. And you are going to fill out the name and the classification for each of these typefaces that are listed. There's a handful, a couple per page, some cases 3. And you are going to figure out what these typeface names are by visiting the Identifont website. And the way this website works is by asking you a series of questions. This is a phenomenal resource. There used to be another website called What the Font that was fantastic as well. I don't think that website exists though anymore, unfortunately. But essentially, you can search by fonts through a number of different categories, by name, by similarity, by picture. You can actually upload a picture, which is pretty cool. This is the way that you guys are going to figure these out, by the appearance. And they're going to ask you a series of questions. Does your typeface have serifs or no? And you'll answer the first question, and it's going to ask you a second question. Okay. And it's amazing how working through this. So at this point, it's narrowed it down to 5,162 possible fonts. So you will just potentially answer a series of questions for each of these until you have found the name of the font. Sometimes you'll find these rather quick. You'll be amazed at how it only takes 3 or 4 questions to get to where you need to be. In other cases, it might take more. It might take 6, 7, 8 questions until you have finally done it. But this is basically a really just sort of painless exercise to introduce you to this website and give you the opportunity to practice using it. Okay? So the exercise is due for next class. What I would love for you to do is just download the PDF, and you can just open up that PDF and just type the answers in. If you want, you can do it in Acrobat Pro, or if you want to do it in any other program is fine too. Photoshop, Illustrator, InDesign, any of those programs, whatever you'd like. But essentially, you're just putting in the typeface names and then the typeface classification. I mean, obviously, this is an example of a sans serif typeface. Okay, so that's what I mean in terms of classification. Don't worry about typing your name on the file, but if you could please make sure that you name your file that you submit to me, your last name, we're good to go. Okay, that's going to end up going right inside of our class folder. There's not a folder for it yet, but I'm going to make one right now. It's going to be called Exercise 1, Type Classification. Right, and that is what is due for next class. Any questions on that?
No questions.
Cool. Yeah, it should be pretty straightforward. I mean, and as always, guys, if you think of any questions between now and next class, obviously reach out to me. It's all good. Always happy to answer questions. That was a lot of info though. And I did record this session. When I stopped the recording, like always, this one will probably take a little while to process because that was almost 2-hour lecture. But I will put a link to today's lecture right up at the top of week 5. And what I'll probably end up doing, because we've got another lecture next class, I'll do like what I did like during week 4, where there's 2 links to the different YouTube videos, one for Tuesday's class, one for Thursday's class. So be on the lookout for those if you need to go back and review anything. Yeah, in terms of material then for today, that gets us through where we needed to go. Next class, we will take a look at those exercise. We'll dig into the sans serif lecture, and I'll give you guys a lot of class time to work on the analysis project to set you up for the due date next week. Cool, well, guys, that wraps it up then for today. So again, have fun with the Identifont website. Again, like bookmark that one. It's a great, phenomenal resource. I can't tell you how often I would use that when I run into a typeface in a project that I want to know what it is. Yeah, definitely for next class, even though there's nothing necessarily due for the type analysis, it would be a great idea for next class to walk into class at least like knowing, like us walk virtually in class, but you know what I mean, like coming into to our virtual class for next time, knowing like what direction you want to go with on that project. Okay, that way you can spend some time during the work time actually taking advantage of that time. All right, guys, again, fantastic job on those type specimen books. I will I'll be on the lookout for any questions you guys might have, but otherwise have a fantastic rest of the evening, and I will see you guys all on Thursday.
Thank you. You too.